said, here's a lesson you don't get. I said, I loop the loop when I get loose. I said, ignition, ignite your night out.
Hello, and welcome back to the Not Fade Away podcast. Today we're talking about an actor, comedian, and blues singer who at one point in his short career had the #1 record, #1 late night show, and the #1 movie at the box office, a feat that has never been repeated, John Belushi. I am your host, Margot D., and this is episode 3. Thanks for dropping by. Follow all of our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. And for comments and suggestions, email me at notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. This is the show that pays homage to the gifted people in music who are no longer with us. And this episode in particular is special to me because my friend Kate Klempfner will be our special guest. Kate is here today to talk about John Belushi because he was her godfather, and she has some really great stories to tell. She also happens to be a really cool chick, and it's my pleasure to have you all meet her. Kate, say hi to everyone.
Hi, my name is Kate Ruby Klempfner, and John Belushi was my godfather.
Now, a word of warning with this episode, I'm a bit of a giggle puss and an interjector when Kate is speaking because we are old friends, and I just really enjoyed this chat. So if any of that bothers you, I'm starting off right now with an apology. I will also be peppering the show with news clips and interviews with key folks in John's life. Plus, I enlisted some of my favorite podcasting friends to help me out, bringing some of the more favorite quotes and anecdotes to life. Let's get started.
Coming to you on a dusty road. Good loving, I got a truckload. And when you get it, you got something. Don't worry, 'cause I'm coming. I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man.
John Adam Belushi was born January 24th, 1949 in Humboldt Park, a neighborhood in Chicago. He was raised in Wheaton, Illinois, along with his 3 siblings, Billy, Jimmy, and Marion. John was raised in the Albanian Orthodox Church and attended Wheaton Community High School, where he met the love of his life, Judith Jacqueline. John showed his early interest in music with his first band, the Ravens, where he played drums and vocals. He was 16 when their single, Listen to Me Now, was released. Here is a sample of that record.
Listen to me now. Listen to the words that I gotta say. I caught you with that guy, baby, too many times, and it's gonna be the end of the line. Well, I know. You know. Once I said if you ever left me, I'd be so lonely. I'd always love you, I still do. But we're all through.
The song never really took off, and he eventually quit the group, but John stayed in touch with all of his friends. John was very popular at Wheaton High, where he was voted homecoming king and most humorous. He was co-captain of the football team and was a linebacker known as Killer Belushi to his friends and teammates. Here, Judith talks about dealing with John's charisma and early ability to attract people into his orbit.
John was co-captain of the football team and a candidate for homecoming king. When the king and queen were announced at the dance, John seemed embarrassed that he'd won. The crown was too small. He felt silly posing for photos. It was tradition that the king and queen would dance together. It was my first taste being with a celebrity. That part of you was pushed aside and left patiently until the commotion was over and photos were complete. John came and took my hand. He wanted to leave right away. Judith Belushi Paisano.
He graduated in 1967 and turned down a football scholarship at Western Illinois to attend junior college instead at the College of DuPage, where he earned an associate's degree. John's father, Adam, was from Albania and felt he should give his restaurant business to his eldest son, but John always refused. He instead started a comedy troupe in Chicago, the West Compass Trio, with Tino and Sana and Steve Bashekis in 1970. John was catching on in the comedy community there, and in 1971, he was asked to join the famed Second City improv comedy troupe. John was the first and only member ever who started on the main stage. He began working with people you may have heard of, including Harold Ramis and Brian Doyle Murray. In 1972, John was offered a role in National Lampoon's Lemmings, which was a comedy spoof of Woodstock, along with Chevy Chase and Christopher Guest. It played off-Broadway in New York and was a huge success. But John had a hard time at first dealing with the personalities of National Lampoon. Chase and Guest loved to tease him for being, in their words, ethnic, and coming from a blue-collar, working-class background. If you've ever seen the documentary Drunk, Stoned, Brilliant, Dead, The National Lampoon Story, you will realize that the background for the legendary comedy group was created solely by privileged, wealthy, Ivy League-educated men. In the early days especially, women and ethnic people are not well represented in this world. And John felt overwhelmed sometimes at the very whiteness of the National Lampoon. But John was a big hit with the audience, and he was always guaranteed to rock the crowd every time with his fearless Joe Cocker impersonation. Here's a clip of John playing Joe.
What would you do if I sang have to? Would you stand up and look out on me? Lend me your ear and I'll sing you a song. Well, I will try not to sing out of key. Oh, baby, I get
Soon, John asks Judy to move to New York City, where he joins the National Lampoon Radio Hour. She gets a job in the art department of the National Lampoon magazine, and the Radio Hour studios are in the same building. John excels at creating interesting characters that are rebellious and mock the social mores of the time. He went to Toronto to meet the Second City folks there and connected with a very young standout, Dan Aykroyd. John offered him a job with National Lampoon, but Dan turned it down because of prior commitments. In February 1975, NBC called Canadian Lorne Michaels about creating a variety program to air on Saturday nights, as they were no longer allowed to show Johnny Carson reruns at that time. Lorne said okay, but only if the show was live and featured young talent.
Okay? Am I ready? Dave's ready. Dave, you ready?
Here, you're John.
Okay, all right.
Are they ready? Now they're ready.
Okay, I'm going to do some loosening up exercises. Take to the right. Okay, take to the left. A double take to the right. And a double take to the left. Okay, let's work on the eyebrows now. Ready? Right eyebrow, up, down, and start. Okay, left, up, down, up, down. Okay, up, down. Fine, good. All right? Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Saturday Night Show. The show is live. The show is not on tape, so all the mistakes happening on this show are real. We don't plan anything, because everything is real.
John played several characters, including the Greek diner owner, Beethoven, Captain Kirk, the Weekend Update but no guy, and the samurai warrior who surprisingly held a variety of regular jobs. Around this time, John is heading out to the blues clubs at night when Dan, as a longtime lover of the music, chided him for not having a better appreciation for his Chicago roots. Every once in a while, they were able to coax the owners to give them a spot on the stage and try out an early version of the Blues Brothers. John would sing lead, and Dan would play the harmonica and dance along nimbly. Eventually, the act caught on, and they received positive reviews from people as lofty as Mick Jagger. Word got back to Lorne that John and Dan were creating an underground blues scene and offered them the chance to warm up the SNL audience before the live show. It was such a hit that Lorne had the band on as a featured guest January 17th, 1976. Now, a little backstory here. A recurring bit on the first season of Saturday Night Live was the cast dressed in bee costumes and performing in random sketches. John thought it was a dumb, cheap idea. He also was self-conscious about being the heaviest cast member and hated how the round costumes accentuated his frame. But then he came up with a brilliant idea. What if he sang Slim Harpo's King Bee while dressed in the bee costume and introduced the audience to the Blues Brothers? Check it out here.
I'm a king, babe. I want you to be my queen. Yeah. I'm a king, babe, baby. Want you to be my queen. Well, together we can make honey, baby. The wilderness never
the scene. Well, stay with me.
While his career was on the rise, was starting to come at the cost of his relationship with Judy. During the fall of 1976, she kicks John out of their West Village apartment that cost him a whopping $400 a month, by the way. He was drinking and hanging out with his friends at all different hours, and Judy had had enough. But John was remorseful, and he worked his tail off to show her how they should get back together, and by that Christmas they had made up. Judy and John were married on December 31st, 1976.
I don't know what to do since you've gone. I miss the tenderness of your arms. Please come back to me, come back to me. If you want me back, I'll be waiting here for your call. But please don't hesitate, 'cause I can't wait, I'll be here. Say the words I long to hear.
So it's important to note that at this time, Chevy Chase was actually considered the biggest star at SNL, the show. He was the guy that the audience most related to. Chevy was the superstar, and everyone from the executives at NBC to the cast at SNL knew it. So when he quit the show after the first season because his model girlfriend on the West Coast wanted him to move out there, everyone was kind of freaked out. They worried that the coolness of the show would fade with him no longer there. But the opposite happened. With Chevy gone, the rest of the original not ready for primetime players were able to break out and try a whole slew of new characters, such as Gilda's Baba Wawa and Dan's Julia Child impression. Bill Murray joined the cast in the second season as well, becoming a huge hit with the audience. But the real star of the show now was John. For the next 2 seasons, he became a fan favorite for his celebrity impressions, his wackier video clips, and occasionally singing with Dan on the show. It didn't take long for Hollywood to come knocking. So fast forward to 1978, and John is featured in 3 films that year. First was Old Boyfriends, starring Rocky's Talia Shire, Keith Carradine, and Buck Henry. Then he joined the cast of Goin' South, which was directed by Jack Nicholson and was the motion picture debut of Mary Steenburgen. What did he have to say about that experience? John later claimed that Jack treated him, quote-unquote, like shit, and added that he really hated the man. However, he has the exact opposite experience with the next picture he filmed that year.
See if you can guess what I am now. I'm a zit. Get it? Let's go right here.
National Lampoon's Animal House was sort of a homecoming for John. The script was written by his friends Harold Ramis and Doug Kenny and featured the bawdy humor of his early comedy career. Directed by John Landis, the setting for the film was the American Northwest, early 1960s at the rowdy Faber College. As Bluto Batarsky, John became next-level famous as he stole every single scene he was in. He did this while working on SNL at the same time. John would work on SNL from Wednesday to Saturday night for each live show on the East Coast, and then would fly west on Sundays to the Oregon location for filming on Mondays and Tuesdays. Here is a clip of co-star Tim Matheson on Tom Green's show talking about John.
When you were making Animal House and all those scenes with Belushi, did you get to know John Belushi pretty well, or?
Yeah, John was, he was very nice to me, and because there was always a lot of conflict between New York actors and LA actors, and attitude. New York actors, you guys don't know anything about acting. We are the real artists, but Belushi was very gracious, and me and Bruce McGill, who played D-Day, would generally pick up John from the airport on Sunday afternoon. We go back to John's house because they put him in a house away from all of the bad influence of the rest of the cast.
Sure.
And keep him out of trouble. And we'd take John home because he'd go to do Saturday Night Live on he'd leave on Wednesday night, fly back to New York, work there Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday night, and then Sunday they'd probably pour him back on a plane and then ship him back to us, where he'd work Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday on Animal House.
Yeah.
So, but he was lovely. He was one of the sweetest, nicest, most generous, people and performers. obviously terribly inventive and funny, and I used to always just hang out and watch him do his stuff, like the great scene of him walking through the cafeteria, and that was all improvised. It was one take. I mean, it was just like, God, I mean, it was just, for me in my first comedy, it was just watching a master at work, and he was very gracious and very great. And I think that the tragedy of John Belushi was that he was into the rock and roll world because of all the guest artists that they had on Saturday Night Live. They had the musician artists, so Rolling Stones would be there one weekend, and so you're hanging out with these kind of guys, and they're doing all sorts of drugs.
Right.
And I think in television and motion pictures, I'd never run into really those kinds of things, and that was a whole new era and a whole new kind of commingling of mediums, TV, and he was a TV star, a movie star, and a recording artist star, and a performing in the Blues Brothers.
Yeah.
So I think all of that took its toll on John, because he was a wonderful man.
It was exhausting work, but John had a ball with both the cast and crew. Sunday afternoons, he would host football screening at his rented cottage, and would later venture out to local bars to check out new music in his downtime with Judy and co-star Bruce McGill. To say the movie was a big hit is an understatement. Released July 28, 1978, with the original budget being $2.8 million, it eventually raked in over $141 million. Also in 1978, Michael Klempner, my friend Kate's dad, met John and Dan to let them know he thought their act was not only legit, but they deserved a record deal. Kate's father, a longtime music insider, brokered that deal with Atlantic Records, and the Blues Brothers became a legitimate recording act.
My dad signed them. The record company didn't, my dad signed them. He got them signed, to Atlantic. He saw the potential as an act. And then they put together the band, which was, was the most dangerous band in rock and roll or something, or the world's most dangerous band or something. And it was Paul Schaefer and Donald Duck Dunn. And, if you look at, it's really like member for member, one of the greatest bands, if not the greatest band ever put together. It's like, if you look at who the people were in it.
The band went to work immediately, putting on as many live gigs as possible to prepare for their big recorded appearance, opening for Steve Martin at the Universal Amphitheater in Los Angeles, September 8th, 1978. However, there were some hiccups along the way.
We were busy getting everything together, hiring people, booking studio time, but in the meantime, something went screwy with the record deal. Atlantic didn't want to put money up front for the 9 nights of live recording. John was pushing for the cash and getting really worked up over it. We had all of these commitments we had to meet. Coincidentally, about this time, John got his bonus from Universal Animal House for $250,000, the first real money we'd ever had. I knew how much John wanted this to happen, so I suggested we front the money to get it done. We were looking at spending between $150,000 and $200,000 in the space of a month, which was more than John made in 2 years of Saturday Night Live, Going South, and Animal House combined. I never thought we wouldn't make it back, but that was a pretty naive assumption on my part. Rule number 1 for actors is never use your own money. It wasn't the first rule we broke, and it was the best investment we ever made. Judith Belushi Paisano.
On November 28, 1978, Briefcase Full of Blues from Atlantic Records reached number 1 on the Billboard charts with the songs Rubber Biscuit and then Soul Man. So this is the time when John had the number 1 movie, number 1 record, and was starring on the number 1 late night show on television all at the same time. It is really so challenging to verbalize how incredible his fame was. John was the man of the late 1970s comedy and music scene. I asked my friend Kate if she has any memories of John at this time.
Yes, my parents, my father was a pallbearer at his funeral. They were very good friends. John and Dan were my godfathers. And that's, I know that, John has this reputation of being a real, the partier and drug addict and whatnot, but it's not like my mom would have, let him be my godfather if that was the case. He really wasn't that until the end. He's wild and crazy, but no more, I think, than anyone else at the time. And I know from what my parents had told me that he took the role as godfather very seriously. Like, very much remember being at their house on West 9th Street in New York. And also in Martha's Vineyard, him and his wife Judy, who I still keep in touch with.
Oh, really?
And, yeah. She's super cool and sweet. They were high school sweethearts. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I have, it's like the time of your life when you only remember, like my memories are all of people's knees, because I was like so little, but I remember, that he was really nice to me. And I wasn't scared of him. Like there was no like, and that he was really funny. And my most vivid memory was we were having, my parents were having some sort of dinner party, and they had these wicker chairs, or no, it's some sort of straw thing. I don't know what rattan. I don't know what they call it. Mm-hmm. John comes back into the dining room, sits down in the chair, and literally busts through the straw, and it was so funny. I mean, what was I, 3? And I was laughing just as hard as the adults. It was just the funniest thing. And he played it up. And I think my dad hung the broken chair up on the wall. I mean, he was, he was aware. My dad was always very appreciative of how cool it was. Those kind of things were.
In mid-1979, John left SNL with Dan for a movie career. This is a time when many actors felt that to work in television was just a cut above dinner theater. If you were a quote, unquote, real actor that cared about your reputation as well as your craft, you worked in films or on stage. You rejected television the first chance you got. John was a bona fide superstar now, and he was being offered major parts in big films. Unfortunately for him, they were not exactly the hits he needed to keep him happy or help him feel secure about his acting abilities.
December 1941. The California coast. The Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor.
What?
A nation's heroes were on the alert.
Look, you guys, a Jap sub!
The dummy's right.
California could be next.
What did I shoot there? I don't know!
This is war.
A country's honor was at stake. The lives of millions would be protected by a brave few. This is their story.
Excuse us, ma'am.
From the director of Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The most explosive comedy spectacular ever filmed.
What the hell do you people think you're doing?
Dan Aykroyd, Ned Beatty, John Belushi, Lorraine Garrett, Murray Hamilton, Christopher Lee, Tim Matheson, Toshiro Mifune, Warren Oates, Robert Stack, Treat Williams.
I can assure you, there will be no bombs dropped here.
Boy, that was fun!
Universal Pictures and Columbia Pictures present an 18 production of a Steven Spielberg film. 1941.
Sayonara, sucker!
The first big flop he appeared in was the only comedy Steven Spielberg has ever attempted, 1941. It was a tale about a wacky group of Californians dealing with life in Los Angeles right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. John, Judy, and their friend Penny Marshall dressed in 1940s costumes to attend the premiere. They were aghast when they sat in the theater and watched the movie unfold in front of a packed house with not a single laugh coming from the audience. Co-starring with Dan, Ned Beatty, Treat Williams, Christopher Lee, and Robert Stack, the movie opened to dismal reviews. Budgeted to cost over $35 million at the time, which would equal about $125 million in today's dollars, the movie took in only $2 million in the opening weekend, and soon died off after that. So that was in December of 1979. But things turned around quickly when the Blues Brothers became a movie.
It's 106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses.
Hit it.
Filmed in Chicago and directed by John Landis, the production took over John's hometown, and it was his popularity that made filming some of the more complicated sequences much easier. John was loved by everyone. Music fans, comedy fans, cops, politicians, fellow stars. Everyone wanted to work with John. Knowing how big the movie is now and how it introduced blues music for the first time to millions of people, it's important to remember that at that time, Aretha Franklin, Cab Calloway, Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, and even James Brown were just not working very much. They were the first choice as music acts for the film, and every single one of them was free.
I not only worked with John on the Blues Brothers film, I also worked with him on Saturday Night Live. He was the kind of guy who would volunteer to sit with me and prepare my lines, since I obviously couldn't rely on the cue cards. He was a sweet, gentle, thoughtful man who did whatever he could think of to make me feel comfortable while we were putting the show and later the film together. John was a loyal fan of rhythm and blues, and I know for a fact that the Blues Brothers movie and soundtrack got a hell of a lot of people back into R&B. They especially helped people like Aretha Franklin and me reach the young kids who might not have even known we existed. During the recent European and Asian tours, I met a number of young people who got hip to the music through the Blues Brothers film and records, and I am telling you that as far as commercial interest in R&B is concerned, John helped get that ball rolling again. Man, we owe him. Ray Charles.
So the plot of the film is simple. Jake and Elwood Blues are asked to help pay a tax debt to save a Catholic orphanage where they were raised. Since Jake is an ex-con, the only way he knows how to raise money quickly and legally is to bring the Blues Brothers back together and play a big show in Chicago. In the meantime, they're being chased by rednecks, Illinois Nazis, pissed off cops, and Jake's girlfriend played by Carrie Fisher, all on the way to their climactic gig. Now, Kate's dad is featured in the film as a record executive who shows up just in time to offer the band a contract and give them their money. Here's the big scene.
Oh my God, the mafia's after
You
us
guys
now.
were hot. You were great, insane. I've got to record you.
Bullshit.
Bullshit? I don't bullshit. I'm president of Clarion Records, the largest recording company on the Eastern Seaboard.
So what?
Here's $10,000 in advance on your first recording session. Is it a deal?
Yeah, sure it's a deal. Yeah, sure it's a deal. Listen, all these cops out here, they're sort of waiting for us. We gotta get out of here without nobody seeing us. You know a back door out of this place?
Sure. I used to be head bouncer here back in the 70s. There's an electrical service duct right behind your drummer's riser.
Listen, do us a favor. Take $1,400 and give it to Ray's Music Exchange in Calumet City. And give the rest to the band.
You got it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
I asked Kate if she has any set gossip about that scene, and she did not disappoint me.
Records you, and he's, gives them the money they need, and then they go on. But it's, a bit part.
No, but it's a great part. Are you kidding me? It's one of my favorites.
Yes, he plays like, sort of little, the angel out of nowhere.
Yeah. It's great because he shows up in this scene and it's just like he's giving exposition. It's the only reason he's there. Do you know what I mean? And they do that in movies, but they make it so obvious that it's hilarious. Like, because they have to go from the stage out of the building. So how do we make that happen?
Right, because he was like, I was head bouncer back here in the 70s. And, they wrote that in because he had actually been a bouncer. So it was pretty, you can see at the end of the scene, he sort of goes, whew. Like, you can see him exhale because he was, his voice didn't even sound like his voice. He was so nervous. And apparently they made him costume designer was the director's wife or girlfriend or something, and made the suit they made him wear. My father was a very well-dressed man. Like, he was, I wouldn't say metrosexual. I would just say, or he was stylish. Like, he was... even though, may have been overweight, but well-dressed.
Sure.
And it was a really tacky suit. And it was a really tacky suit, like a 3-piece polyester thing. And my dad, who didn't do anything that anyone ever wanted him to do, he was forced to wear that suit. And they said, oh, well, it's what a record guy would wear. He's like, I am a record guy. And so he wound up giving that suit to the doorman at the Beverly Hills Hotel.
FYI, I'm going to post my full interview with Kate separately so you can hear even more gossip from the set and about her dad. More on that at the end of the show. By the way, the movie's budget was about $30 million, and at that time it included a line item for cocaine. Yes, you heard that right. A line item just for cocaine.
About the Blues Brothers. We had a budget in the movie for cocaine for night shoots. Everyone did it, including me. Never to excess and never to where I wanted to buy it or have it. But John, he just loved what it did. It sort of brought him alive at night. That superpower feeling when you start to talk and converse and you figure out you could solve all the world's problems. Dan Aykroyd.
There are dozens of stories about John taking off during the shoot of this film. He would stick his thumb out and hitch a ride and just be gone. He would just show up at people's homes and ask for a sandwich and a place to nap. There was the time a police officer noticed him on the street and gave him a lift to the nightclub. His energy was off the charts, and he loved filming the Blues Brothers, but was also terrified it would seem like a joke to people. John was dead serious about the music, and relieved when the film did well and received mostly positive reviews. The soundtrack was another huge bestseller, and the band even recorded a third album titled Made in America, which had a minor hit with Who's Making Love with Your Old Lady. So the act was doing so well, a tour was planned. But there was a problem. John liked cocaine and food just a bit too much. He could barely get through a song without huffing and puffing. Enter Smokey Wendell. Smokey Wendell was ex-New York State Police and ex-Secret Service who once took Nixon to China and had helped Joe Walsh of the Eagles get sober. He was ready for the challenge of John. When the band toured the country, John was taken care of by Smokey, who helped him stay off drugs by basically threatening any dealer that came near him. John was able to tour as soberly as he could manage, and the band later claimed it was a really wonderful tour. In addition to having Smokey take care of him, John started to work out and was looking fit. He was also cutting down on that habit of calling people at all hours and seemed really steady. In fact, he felt so good that after just a little over a year of service, Smokey felt John was ready to be on his own. This is in February 1981. John promised to look him up if he thinks he will fall off the wagon, but he assured him that that would never happen because now he is a new man.
You know, they look very frightening, but
Then it seemed John just got sick of the blues. He was no longer tethered to Saturday Night Live. It was now the 80s, a new decade, and he felt he accomplished all he could for R&B and now turned his attention to punk rock. Specifically, the band Fear. John somehow convinced Lorne Michaels to book them on Saturday Night Live in a legendary, disastrous performance. The first and last time slam dancing was allowed at Studio 8H. He started giving away all of his old blues records and just wanted to hang out in places like CBGB's until all hours of the night. He also wanted to change his image acting-wise. Tired of being typecast as a dope and a party animal, he made a complete left turn and starred in Michael Apted's Continental Divide with Blair Brown as his co-star.
They'd love to have me do Animal House goes to camp, Animal House joins the Army, Animal House rides a space shuttle, but it's not the way I work.
John played a version of a family friend, Mike Royko. His character, Ernie Suchak, is a newspaper columnist who is assigned to research a scientist, played by Brown, in the Rocky Mountains. It's a sweet little film written by Lawrence Kasdan, and John got some positive reviews for his work. According to longtime booster Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times, Belushi's character in this movie is quite unlike his self-destructive slob in National Lampoon's Animal House. It shows the gentleness and vulnerability that made him so appealing in some of Second City's quieter skits. Released in September of 1981, Continental Divide quickly disappeared from the box office. John took this loss hard, and he became depressed and anxious about the state of his career. That November, he appeared in Steve Martin's Best Show Ever TV special, along with his old SNL co-star, Lorraine Newman. In the meantime, John is upset at the state of his latest film, which he co-starred with Dan, their very final production, Neighbors.
Not too distant suburb, on a very quiet street, Earl Keese, a reserved, hard-working homeowner, sits calmly waiting for his dinner. Little does he know, he's about to meet the neighbors. Ramona.
Hello. can I do for you?
Anything you like. The question is, what do you want in return?
And Vic.
So, what do you say, neighbor?
Welcome to the end of the road, I guess.
It's a great house.
Thank you.
I mean mine.
And somehow his life will never be the same.
Who goes there?
Hi, it's Earl Keys.
Columbia Pictures presents John Belushi.
I swear to God, Enid, we may have to move. They're very strange people.
Dan Aykroyd. Kathy Moriarty.
Your left ball in the corner pocket.
In Neighbors. Lock the doors.
Hey, Earl, you go to hell. You're not getting back in here.
They're coming your way Friday, December 18th. Neighbors. Rated R.
Neighbors is what we term a cringe comedy now. Kind of think of like Larry David or Seinfeld. At that time, it was considered daring because Dan and John decided just before production began to switch parts. In this movie, Dan would be the obnoxious slob, and John would be the square who puts up with his boorish behavior. Sounds fun, right? Filming began on a series of all-night shoots in Staten Island with director John Avildsen, who had won an Oscar in 1976 for Rocky and wanted to give comedy a go. John was trying to fight his addiction to cocaine at night with these shoots. He was a dry drunk, and the shooting of this film made him angry because he and Dan did not trust the director. The thing is, the toughest kind of comedy to film and perform is black comedy, which is what Neighbors was, when the audience is expected to root for basically the bad guys versus the good guys who aren't asking for any trouble. It's a tricky move, and Avildsen was just not up for the challenge. John and Dan repeatedly tried to have him fired from the shoot, and according to all the cast members, including Kathy Moriarty and Catherine Walker, the entire filming process of Neighbors was a misery. There were constant arguments on how scenes should be played, and the script was always being reworked on the set. Now it's considered something of a cult classic, but the critics at the time hated the film, and John was given some rather scathing reviews. The only thing John liked about the film was being able to include Fear on the soundtrack. Released December 18th, 1981, it was a minor hit at the box office at the time, but John was nervous. He had several projects on the horizon, but very few really appealed to him. The one exception was Noble Rot, that he was co-writing with Don Novello, who gained fame playing Father Guido Sardici on Saturday Night Live. The film was a comedy about the wine industry, and Novello tried to get John to focus on their script by staying up in his native Northern California, far away from the temptations of New York and LA. They spent a few weeks on the script, and then John headed back to New York to be with Judy and find out what the work situation was like there. He became anxious about the movies his manager Bernie Brillstein had lined up for him and decided to go back out west and confided to Dan that he felt that his star power was diminishing. At this time, Dan was busy working on the script for Ghostbusters. He begged John to be patient and not just take the next project based on money or just because he was bored. He wanted him to be choosy. John told him he was heading out for LA just for a few quick meetings and would come right back. Both Dan and Judy begged him not to go, but his mind was set. He simply had too much energy to expend, and with nothing for sure lined up movie-wise, John felt the need to fill up his schedule. John and Judy went out one last time before he took off for LA.
A little after 4 a.m, we ended up at this club at 3rd Avenue and 13th in the East Village. About that time, the energy in the clubs always gets darker, and I was ready to go. I wanted John to go home with me. He wanted to stay out. He walked me to a cab, and even though I was angry, kissed me goodnight. As the cab pulled off, I turned, expecting to see him walking back into the club or talking with someone, but he was just leaning against the building, watching me pull away. He looked exhausted. Startled, I waved to him. I don't know if he saw me, but that was the last time I saw him, just watching the cab as it rounded the corner. It was the exact same corner as the very first apartment we shared in New York 10 years before. Judith Belushi Paisano.
On March 4th, 1982, in Los Angeles, John met with Bernie Brillstein and the head of Paramount Pictures, Michael Eisner, about what they wanted him to take on next. He had been drinking, using cocaine, smoking, and indulging in a new habit, heroin, for 4 days straight at this point. One of the films discussed was The Joy of Sex, which was a script that had been floating around Hollywood for several years. John would be featured as a baby and wearing a diaper in one of the scenes. The very thought of it made him upset, even though it was attached to his good friend, Penny Marshall. John was panicked about his career, but was still in a position to score a big payday. Bernie encouraged him to take the deal for The Joy of Sex and earn an easy $2 million, which is about $5 million in today's dollars. John said he would think about it and asked Bernie to lend him $1,800 for a guitar. This is a time before ATMs, so it was not unusual for a client to ask for money to borrow cash when the banks weren't open. But Bernie had a bad feeling what John was really going to do with the money. Yet he handed it over anyway. The one bright thing he enjoyed work-wise on this trip was a cameo on Police Squad, a comedy on ABC TV that was taking off with its silly, irreverent humor. Each week, a celebrity played a corpse as a joke. John suggested they film him with a needle in his arm. The producers instead shot him wearing cement shoes underwater. That clip has never been shown to the public. John soon meets Catherine Evelyn Smith, known as Kathy, who was a Canadian attached to many famous musicians, including members of the band and Gordon Lightfoot. Throughout the 60s and 70s, she went from being a backup singer to a groupie to a drug dealer who knew the best places to score whatever you desired. At one time, she was a beautiful woman who became badly addicted to alcohol and lost all of her previous ambitions. She had so enchanted Gordon Lightfoot, he wrote his hit song Sundown just for her. Now she was reduced to being a hanger-on and a drug supplier. She and John used coke right away. He then asked her to score heroin. So once again, this was a relatively new drug for John, who had previously swore he would never touch it due to his fear of needles. But at this point in his life, not working and feeling embarrassed about the box office failures, the usual drugs of choice for him, cocaine and alcohol, were no longer enough to ease his depression and anxiety. John took it to the next level first by snorting heroin, which eventually led to injecting the drug to feel the powerful high. Kathy stayed with him at Chateau Marmont in Bungalow 3. After hemming and hawing for hours over whether to take the part, John calls Burlstein and Eisner and tells them, yes, he will do The Joy of Sex. He later notifies Michael Eisner's boss, Senior Vice President Jeff Katzenberg, and arranges to meet him the next day to discuss the logistics. He is even cheeky enough to ask that Katzenberg give him a wake-up call before the appointment. He then rings Kathy asking for heroin. They spend the next 4 hours buying and using drugs all over Los Angeles. He calls Dan and leaves a message that is indecipherable, so Dan runs to Judy's apartment and tells her he's worried about John. They realize now they have to rescue him, so Judy calls Smokey. At this point, Smokey is semi-retired, but he agrees to get on next day's flight to L.A. He promises to leave first thing in the morning. John and Kathy go to the private club on the rocks. He's complaining everywhere about the pressure he's under to be John Belushi and how he wants to expand his acting work. Kathy and John go to the bathroom and they shoot a speedball, which is a combination of cocaine and heroin. They spend 5 hours at the club and shoot up several times. Around midnight, they head back to the Chateau Marmont, where John gets sick in the parking lot. When returning to the bungalow, John finds out that both Robin Williams and Robert De Niro were looking for him. John admired De Niro as a method actor and previously told him he was considering writing a script about the punk rock movement, which would include a scene of John's character injecting heroin. He asked De Niro, should he actually shoot up the real drug on camera? And De Niro said yes. The only way to know a character is to experience life exactly as that character would. Otherwise, you're just play acting, and the audience won't believe you. Sometime after midnight, Robin Williams shows up to check up on John. This was a new friendship, and Williams was taken by how sweet and gentle John was when he brought him to the set of Mork and Mindy. Both were huge fans of Jonathan Winters, who was a new cast member, and John was thrilled to watch him work in person. Robin accepted a line of coke and tried to engage with John. He later said he was totally creeped out by Kathy Smith and left soon after. An hour or so later, De Niro showed up, and he left just as quickly for the same reason. At 3:15 a.m., Kathy shoots up John one last time and puts him to bed. In the early morning, she wakes up to check up on him. She can hear John snoring and decides he's fine. She takes his Mercedes out at 10:30 a.m. to go to a local pub to have a drink and bet on the horses. Sometime after that, trainer Bill Wallace shows up with a typewriter per John's request and is ready to give him a training session. He finds him unresponsive. Bill clears away John's airway of mucus and phlegm and performs CPR on him for several minutes, but it's too late. John had died some point after Kathy left. He was 33 years old.
Comedian John Belushi died today at the age of 33 in the prime of a career which had already made him a part of American comic folklore. We'll focus tonight on his life, his death, and his remarkable talent. We'll talk with TV Guide critic Robert McKenzie, with comedian Milton Berle, and we'll have a commentary from contributing correspondent.
At the time, many of his friends found it hard to believe that John had overdosed. First of all, John was built like a tank, and second, he hated needles. How could this have happened?
The thing that killed John was not a habitual element in his list of pleasures. I believe he was being led into an experiment. He was being assisted in flirtation with this new and dangerous substance. 3 packs a day, a bottle of Cavassier, La Cocaina, maybe. But Jones was not his Jones. The Los Angeles Times reported that 2 movie producers claimed John was shooting this stuff for 2 years. People, the man who grasped me, who danced with me, who met my eye and planned the future was not a junkie. As a hypo, it made me laugh. It was not a tool in life. The John I knew could only have been assisted into oblivion during the course of an experiment. He hated needles and could not have inserted the hypo into himself. He wasn't that good a mechanic. Dan Aykroyd.
I asked Kate what her parents told her about his death.
Yeah, so I remember playing with him on the beach, but I didn't have a lot of understanding about what was going on then, obviously. When he died, my parents told me that it was because he hadn't taken good care of himself. Which is, a fair enough thing to tell, a 4-year-old kid. And it's actually in Judy Belushi's book, she asked me if I knew why John died. And I said, yes, it was because he didn't eat his vegetables and he didn't brush his teeth. Or something like, something to that effect, because, if you didn't take good care of yourself at 4 years old, that's what it translates to.
So John's favorite place in the world was Martha's Vineyard. It was the only space where he felt safe and relaxed. He and Judy decided years before that they wanted to be buried there when it was their time. So to get to Martha's Vineyard, you have to take a ferry out to the island, and first you need to get through Boston. So the press is staking out the airport in Boston. They're just waiting for John's body to arrive for his funeral. Michael Klempner and Bernie Brillstein went to Atlantic Records and asked them to arrange a private plane to take John from Los Angeles directly to this little airport in Martha's Vineyard. Brillstein himself would take his client home to his funeral.
2 days after John died, I flew with his body back east. The plane was a small 7-seater, too small to put a coffin in the cargo hold. So they just put John's body in a canvas body bag and laid it across 2 seats. I sat in the row next to him and we took off. If it had been a movie, where people always talk to dead bodies, probably would have had one of those stupid, "How could you do this?" speeches. But it wasn't, so I just did my best to try and sleep. It was the worst 7.5 hours of my life. Bernie Brillstein.
John was buried with a proper Albanian funeral, which went against his wishes for a Viking funeral, where his body would have been set off to sea in a flaming boat. But his mother would not allow him to be cremated in any form. Soon after John died, Smith had told an interview to the National Enquirer and told them that she had given John his fatal speedball. The article was titled, "I Killed John Belushi." After years of going back and forth between the LA District Attorney and Canadian authorities, Smith eventually pled to first-degree manslaughter and got 15 months serving at the California Institute for Women from December 1986 to March 1988. In 1984, she wrote her biography, Chasing the Dragon, talking about her addiction issues. After serving her sentence, she moved to Toronto and worked as a legal secretary. In July 1991, she was arrested in Vancouver for possession of heroin. She currently resides in British Columbia. In 1984, Bob Woodward of All the President's Men fame contacted Judy to write John's memoirs. He promised to come up with a fair and joyful portrayal of her late husband. She was tired of the whole John Belushi was a crazy drug addict angle and was hoping he could offer a more robust and honest version of her husband for those who had never met him. Instead, the book drew the wrath of nearly every single person who agreed to participate. It's a shocking and salacious read on John's life, and if you're a fan of his work, I advise you avoid it. Once again, my friend Kate.
The book Wired, so, obviously Bob Woodward, he's a reputable author. He came, and it was going to be, he sold it as a different story, a real story of John as a man and an actor and who he was as a person, not the persona. Because he was so completely famous at the time, whereas Dan is, he can walk down the street and not be recognized. my father was in an elevator with Dan Aykroyd once, and someone recognized, with Dan Aykroyd and one other guy, a stranger, and the stranger recognized my father from the Blues Brothers movie, and standing next to Dan Aykroyd. Right, that's how. But John couldn't go outside, like he had to wear disguises and things like that, and this Wired was really supposed to be telling the not, sort of rock and roll wasteland version of it, of John's real life. He was class president of his high school, right? Captain of the football team. I think is a better it doesn't always, there were other opportunities he should have taken. My father once told me that, a project he tried to get John to do was they were writing, this P.T. Barnum story, the biography.
Yeah.
And that, so I think he just, he didn't, a little undersold, but so they, his talent, I think, fell victim to this sort of drug overdose death. And everyone was willing to cooperate and give interviews for Wired because they thought they would be sort of, not clearing his name, but telling the true story. And, and then it really came, and when it came out, it was not, at all, painted as a very dark picture. I remember my father being very upset with it. I mean, it's not, very upset. Just that it had nothing, and I know I mentioned it a couple times, but, I know my mom was upset. She, when I asked her about John, I wanted to talk to her a little bit about him before this interview. She was like, we were duped. That's why Judy went and wrote her book, which was called Samurai Widow. It's actually very good. So, because John did the samurai, delicatessen, the samurai character on the early Saturday Night Lives. So,
fans of John Belushi include Chris Farley, who was a big star at SNL in his time in the 1990s. Chris worshipped Belushi and, strangely enough, ended up dead at the age of 33 from a drug overdose. SNL tries to find a new John Belushi every few years, but there really was only one. And I want some of his friends and loved ones to have the last word about him.
About a month before John's death, he came by my apartment in Hollywood. I wasn't home, so he rang my neighbor's bell. They opened the door and freaked out. He went inside, they had some wine, and they talked, and then he took a nap on the couch. When I got home, my neighbors were out walking the dog. They said, "John's asleep inside. Wake him gently." I went in. I got him up when we left. There was always room at the inn for John. Richard Belzer.
The weekend before the Blues Brothers movie began production, John and Judy and Danny and I went to a resort in Wisconsin where John and Judy used to spend their summer when they were younger. The trip was supposed to be for relaxation, with the four of us sharing a tiny cabin, but a horde of fans descended on the place, and we ended up jumping out the back window into thorn bushes and beating a hasty retreat to a drive-in movie, which John watched with his head down. It was difficult for John to relax as his success escalated. The responsibilities of his dynamic samurai side became difficult to maintain. There were signs of depression there, because a part of John always wanted that little cabin in the woods with his friends. It just got tougher to get back to as time wore on.
Rosie Schuster.
The full rewards of knowing John will never be totally unexpected by even those who loved his work, don't care how he died, and are just sorry he's gone. To these people I say his sweetness and generosity were as big as his appetite for life. Dan Aykroyd.
John was never happier with me than when I wrecked the Bluesmobile out in the Hamptons in the summer of 1977. The car was so cheap, he never bothered to get insurance for it. I banged it up to the tune of $600 worth of damage, and it was a $400 car. Judy and I were really afraid of how he was going to react. When he came home, I said, "John, the good news is that you have a brand new rental car in the garage. The bad news? The Bluesmobile has to go away for a while." His face brightened. He never looked so happy because someone else was a fuck-up for a change. Ann Bates.
John was typecast as an uncouth, boorish slob with no discipline.
so you were constantly impressed to discover that he was just the opposite. The sweet, loving, boyish John in Continental Divide was described by some critics as unconvincing, but it was actually a very real side of him. Granted, it was not the only side. He could be so damn dogmatic when he wanted you to share something with him, and when we were both working on the Steve Martin TV special, we had another one of our fights about his musical tastes. He was playing Fear in his dressing room at an inhumane decibel level, and I went in and I said, "Damn you, John! You don't know anything. You're just a faddist and an obnoxious pain in the ass." "Well," he said, "what music do you like?" "Johnny Taylor," I snapped. He rummaged through his records, found a Johnny Taylor album, and gave it to me. I was kind of startled, but that was John. He'd get you nuts, and then he'd turn around and do something sweet. Lorraine Newman.
One of the reasons why John Belushi is in heaven right now. He put together his old high school band, and they played in January, the year he died, at an open mic at the Central in L.A. He loved having his buddies on stage with him in Hollywood, doing the same songs they played 15 years before in Illinois. Who could ask for a better thing to be said about someone in his position than that he didn't forget his old friends? Don Novella.
If John were alive today, he would be 68 years old. Before I say goodbye, I first want to thank a few people who provided voices. Dana Buckler from the How Is This Movie podcast as Bernie Brillstein. David, the producer, from the Unwritable Rant podcast as Dan Aykroyd. Julia Miranda, host of the Unwritable Rant, as SNL writer Ann Beats. Dina Marie from the Twisted Philly podcast as Judith Belushi Pisano. Sean Coca from the Childhood Remastered podcast as Ray Charles. Teresa Gunderson as Rosie Schuster. Chloe Leverol as Lorraine Newman. Nick from the Dependent Independent podcast as Richard Belzer. And Dennis Serra from the Evil podcast as Don Novello. I'm going to publish an episode of the full interview I had with Kate right away, and then I'm going to drop my next episode all about Kurt Cobain very soon. So stay tuned and please subscribe to the podcast if you like what you hear. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for listening to the Not Fade Away podcast. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love what you hear, yay, please leave a review. It helps us so much more than you could ever know. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. You can email us with comments or suggestions to notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to learn more about my other shows, Book vs. Movie, The Fit Bottom Girls, and the Best Neighbors podcast, just follow me at Brooklyn Fit Chick on all social media or check out my main blog, brooklynfitchick.com.